Welcome to Minutes That Matter. My name is Brian McManus, and I'm the lead pastor at Tri-County Baptist Church. Let's begin our time together this morning by asking this. Have you ever gotten yourself involved in a job that was so big? Maybe it was cleaning out a garage or a closet or weeding a flower bed that had become overgrown, that by about halfway through, you were ready to give up. And maybe there were a number of reasons involved. Maybe you realized you didn't have the skill sets that you needed to get the job done, or you didn't have the resources you needed to get the job done, or maybe your environment was working against you. It was too hot, too cold, too wet. And then there were always those people that are such encouragers, right? Hey, you missed a spot. You're doing it all wrong. Why did you do it that way? Or they're just outright working against you. Well, if that's where you're at, or if you've ever been there, or if you know someday you will be there in your life again, where halfway is the hard way, God's word, through the narrative of Nehemiah, has encouragement for you this morning. Well, if you've been with us for any length of time, you know that we're working through lessons from a waiter. And so far, we've learned that when facing difficult news in our life, and when facing a task that seems to be overwhelming, that God has taught us through the book of Nehemiah that we need to pray, plan, and procure. The next lesson that he has for us is probably the most important as we get halfway through a job, and that is this. We need to persist, especially when confronted by opposition, whether it's from within our own heads and our own hearts, or whether it's from our environment or from other people. You see, as Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem, and as he began to get the people together and they began to rebuild the wall, not everybody was happy with what was going on. There were individuals who were not Jews living in the area that did not want to see Jerusalem rebuilt, that did not want to see Jerusalem become a power back in that region again. And so they were doing everything they could to resist what was happening. We see that beginning in chapter 2, verses 19 through 20, through a couple of key characters that were beginning to resist Nehemiah and the people. But then that resistance really ramps up beginning in chapter 4, as in chapter 4, the narrative changes from these individuals, not just kind of trying to demoralize them through speech and words and criticism, but now actual threats. We see that they were threatening to attack them to stop this. And then we see over in chapter 5 that the environment was working against the people to keep them from finishing the rebuilding of the wall. There was a famine in the land. And in order to just complete this and to live and to survive and to get the necessities that they needed, individuals were having to borrow money to buy food and all the other things they needed just to stay alive. And their own countrymen were lending them that money, but charging them just huge amounts of interest. And that was displeasing to God, and it was demoralizing the people. And then when none of this worked, those same enemies of Nehemiah and God's people came alongside and tried to threaten Nehemiah's life, and thereby take out their leader, cut that snake off by the head, and stop the work. And we see what the response was to each one of those attacks, each one of those things that were seeking to demoralize the people and stop the building of the wall. And it's in those responses that I want us to see our own encouragement today as we work through the difficult times that are facing us and the difficult times that we will face. God has for us wonderful lessons to help us persist in what he's called us to do. And so let's look at the first one. Let's take a look at the one where the nation was threatened by attack, and see what the response was to that and what we can learn from that. In chapter 4, in verses 14 and 15, Nehemiah says this to the people. He says, "And I looked, and I rose and said to the nobles and to the officials and to the rest of the people, 'Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord.'" See where he's pointing them back to is not to themselves, not to their own ability, not to their skills in their army in defending themselves or their defenses. He points them back to who started the job, who will help them continue the job, who will help them finish the job, and who will protect them. He says here again, "Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes." He brings them back to Christ. He brings them back to God. As we're facing difficult times, we need to remember who is the one who is empowering us? Who is the one who has called us to do this? Who is the one who is helping us to not only do the job, but to finish the job? It is God who is great and awesome. He will do this as we stay faithful to the activity and to the work that he's called us to. Verse 15, when our enemies heard that it was known to us that God had frustrated their plans. You see, it was God who exposed what was going to happen. It was God who gave up their secret. And it was God who was fighting for them. He says here in verse 15, had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall, each to his work. Now, I do want you to see the divine human cooperative. Later on in that chapter, they just didn't keep on working. They actually posted guards. Each man had a weapon on him, and they continued to work as they were armed for battle and set up guards at night. So in case the enemy did attack, they were ready to defend themselves. But God had exposed it. God would fight for them. God would protect them. And so again, remember, he points us back to God. We can often forget that when we get so involved in the task in front of us that we forget who is empowering us and who is helping us to complete this. Now, in chapter 5, verse 9, in response to the issue of individuals taking advantage of other people through this process, he says in chapter 5, verse 9, Nehemiah says, so I said, the thing that you were doing is not good. It's not good. Ought you not to walk in the fear of our God to prevent the taunts of the nations and our enemies? And so he addresses those who were taking advantage of others during this time and says to them, look, this is not right. This is not morally right. This does not please God. Yes, we have an environmental issue that's working against us, but we don't take advantage of people who are struggling just to accomplish this. You know, I think where this intersects with us today is in the aspect of what I've been seeing in the stores, and this aspect of hoarding or keeping things to ourselves. Now, I know that many of our people and many other believers are being incredibly generous. They're responding correctly to this, and they're making sure that they take what they have and they're sharing it with those that don't have. But friends, let us remind ourselves that when we are in need and others are in need, it's not a time to become selfish, but to become selfless. And we see that response of Nehemiah not only reminding the nobles and those who had money to what God had called them to do and how he had called them to support their fellow countrymen, but then he himself, if you go back and read the rest of this narrative in chapter 5, was freely giving individuals what they needed in order to accomplish the bigger picture. And then to this last one in reference to the threat on Nehemiah's life, he says in chapter 6, verses 10 through 11 here, now, when I went into the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, son of Methabel, who was confined to his home, he said, we can relate to that one, right? Confined to our home. He said, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. They are coming to kill you by night. But I said, should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in. In other words, he wasn't going to give in to fear. He wasn't going to give in to what might happen. He trusted in God and what God had called him to do, and that God would both preserve him and help him to complete the mission he had started. And so again, friends, as we walk through times like this, as we struggle through the halfway point, and as we have our environment and maybe even people working against us, let us remember to go back to God and his character and his promises, and be motivated not by some emotional thing in our life, but rather by the truth of God's character and his word and what he's called us to do. Again, I want to thank you for joining us today on Minutes That Matter. If you haven't yet done so, I would encourage you to hit the like button, hit subscribe, and hit the little bell button over to the right-hand side. If you would like more information about the church, the ministry of the church, hit the Show More button underneath the video description, and it'll take you to places on the internet where you can know more about the Tri-County Baptist family and how you can be a part of this spiritual family if you do not yet have a church family. Again, thank you for being with us today. We're continuing to pray for you all. If you have any needs or questions, please feel free to contact our church. We would be happy to come alongside and help you. You have a blessed and sweet day.